Yes.
So, I'm going to move on to the topic of Second Sight. Did you have any direct contact with Second Sight?
No.
Can we look at poll 001069194, please? And it's the final page of that document that I'd like to start with. This is an email chain that is ultimately forwarded to you, or you're a copy recipient.
Yep.
But I'm going to start at the back. It's the penultimate page, page 4. Thank you very much. So there is an email at the bottom there from Antonio Jamaz.
Tony Jamaz.
And what was his role?
I think he worked in service management in the IT department.
And do you know Dave?
Dave Hulbert, yes. So Dave was in managed services, so I think he was something to do with the relationship with Fujitsu and IT.
Thank you. I'll just read that. It says, the NBSC has been provided with no information regarding the audit press release. Now, do you recall what the audit press release was?
I can't remember the detail. Looking at this email that you presented earlier, I'm assuming that some kind of statement was released about the potential review with Second Sight.
And it says, so I've drafted the following, and if you're happy, I'll send it on to NBSC. As discussed, if we get inquiries from branches regarding the recent press release from Post Office regarding the independent audit of the Horizon system, please use the following quote. So this was a proposal to send this to those who worked on the NBSC.
Yes, because they would have been getting calls from branches asking, they'll have seen it in the local press or national press, and it would have generated some activity.
And it seems, we'll see from the later emails, but it seems as though the concern is that the NBSC will...
They don't know what to do with it, yeah.
And they'll receive requests for audits of their own of branches. Yeah. And the line to take there is the Post Office continues to have absolute confidence in the robustness and integrity of its branch accounting processes. Over the past 10 years, many millions of branch reconciliations have been carried out with transactions and balances accurately recorded by more than 25,000 different sub-postmasters. Was that a line that you were familiar with at all?
I think that was what ended up being used quite a lot within the communications.
Do you know where it was coming from?
I'm not sure where it came from, to be honest, Julian.
If we go up in this chain, and the email on the second page, or third page, sorry, Friday, 22nd of June, 2:38. Thank you very much. It says there, as discussed, it's in the italicized part, as discussed, if we get any inquiries from branches regarding the recent press release from Post Office regarding the independent audit of the Horizon system, please use the following quote, and that's the quote. And then it says below the quote, it says, however, some branches may request to be involved in this exercise. Advise them that we'll forward their details onto the relevant department, but at this time, you have no further details.
Yeah.
And if we could scroll up again in the chain to the top of the second page. This is an email from Kevin Gilliland, is it?
Gilliland, yeah.
And it says there, sorry, if we can scroll to the second page. Yes, that one. Sorry, there we go. Please, can we be absolutely clear that we should make no reference to the option of the audit unless it is specifically requested? I'm sure that all calls will be seeking clarification about the statement, and we don't want to cause unnecessary work and process. What do you understand Kevin to have meant in that email?
I think he's making the assumption that people are just asking the question about the press release. And I would interpret it that he doesn't want to offer the audit unless they ask for it. That's what I've read from that.
So there's a press release that it seems to be about Second Sight's involvement.
And the request to be involved, I think, yeah.
Yes. And Who was Kevin? Can you remind me?
So
Sorry.
Kevin was the network director.
So the network director at that stage was saying that we don't want to give people the option of the audit.
Unless they ask for it.
Yes. And then if we scroll up to the first page, we have those emails forwarded to yourself. Do you know why you were included in this chain?
Yeah, so I worked for Craig at the time. So the people on copy, well, you've got Tony Jamaz, so myself, John Breeden, Lynn, and I think probably Sue did. So we were part of Craig's lead team.
And I'll just read the second and third paragraphs. It says, taking Kevin's point, I would hope that we do not get a great number as it should not be offered, but can you pick up and maintain the request list within your team, please? Are you aware of there being a list of branches that have called in following this press release?
Yeah, because we had to set up a process on the back of that. So I worked with Pat to understand which branches were actually ringing in, and then it was obviously working with Angela to decide what would happen with those branches who'd made that request.
And are you able to tell us, were those branches offered an audit by Second Sight or offered something that they hadn't been offered before?
I think Second Sight were made aware of the request to be included. I don't know what the decision process was about which ones would be included or not. We would have just forwarded the list.
Are you aware of somebody having that contact with Second Sight to forward the list?
I think that was done through Angela van den Bogaard. I didn't have any contact with them directly.
And it says, I'd like to understand the nature/reason background as you would normally when anything is escalated from MBSC. As we always say, a physical audit at branch counts how many beans are there at the time. It doesn't do anything else and certainly doesn't test the system, which is what I believe the independent review is about. Let's see how it develops. Was there an understanding within the post office that a physical audit at branch couldn't really test the system that was being used?
Yeah, I don't think it was there to decide whether the system was functioning correctly from an IT perspective. It was a verification of stock and assets, stock and cash. You had the financial audit and then the compliance audit. I don't think there was any provision for an IT audit as such.
Did you have any further involvement in this particular issue? We'll get on to some meetings that you had with lawyers, etc. But in terms of this specific issue about people calling the MBSC aware of the Second Sight issue.
Yeah, so I think this was the start of the communication. So this was the list that obviously was then forwarded to Second Sight to include. There was then processes that we put in place on the back of that to record and make sure we resolved any branches that were raising concerns about Horizon issues, which then formed part of the weekly call with the various stakeholders, which is part of the agenda that you've included in the pack. So this was just almost like a precursor to those.
So we see, and we'll come to them, those Bond Dickinson notes.
Yeah.
Is that related to this?
It will be. That'll be the end part. This was obviously, I think, just the start of obviously the processes that were followed. They ultimately ended up in those Bond Dickinson conversations.
Yes. Thank you. Can we look at poll 000297444? This is the interim report that was produced by Second Sight. The date of it is July 2013, so we're now a year on.
Yeah.
Can we turn to page 5, please? Did you see this report at the time that it was produced?
I can't recollect. The first time that I think I saw it was when you sent me it.
Let's go through a few of their observations and conclusions. Can we look at paragraph 6.4? It's the bottom of page 5. So it says, in the course of our extensive discussions with Pol over the last 12 months, Pol has disclosed to Second Sight that in 2011 and 2012 it had discovered defects in Horizon Online that had impacted 76 branches. At this time, is that something that you were aware of at all?
No.
If we go over the page, please. The first defect was referred to as the receipts and payments mismatch problem, paragraph 6.6. The second defect referred to as the local suspense account problem, paragraph 6.7. Pol was unaware of this second defect until a year after its first occurrence in 2011. It reoccurred and an unexplained shortfall was reported by a sub-postmaster. Paragraph 7.1. It has become clear that whereas the Horizon system appears to achieve its intended purpose almost all of the time and operates smoothly for most sub-postmasters and their staff, some combinations of events can trigger situations where problems occur. Had those kinds of issues been brought to your attention at all?
No.
If we go over the page to page 8. We have the preliminary conclusions, because this is, of course, the interim report of Second Sight. 8.1, this is an interim report and there's much work still to be done. Any conclusions reached at this point will need to be updated in the light of new information that arises as the investigation continues. And then it lists below that the preliminary conclusions. The first is that we have so far found no evidence of system-wide systemic problems with the Horizon system. We are aware of 2 incidents where defects or bugs in the Horizon software gave rise to, and that's the errors and bugs that we spoke of before that hadn't been brought to your attention. Occasionally an unusual combination of events such as power or communication failure during the processing of a transaction can give rise to a situation where timely, accurate and complete information about the status of a transaction is not immediately available to a sub-postmaster. Is that something that had been brought to your attention?
Not before then, but I think on the back of this, they did some work with the, it was called the fallback and recovery process. So I think following this interim report, I think there was a recommunication back out to branches because it was quite a complicated process to follow. If your connection was lost, there were certain transactions that you could recover immediately and ones that you couldn't. So I think I became aware of that through the subsequent comms that they did on the back of this.
So your understanding of that at the time was that it was a power cut or something like that would cause a recovery issue?
It's the power cut or the communications line. So if the internet signal cut out mid-transaction, there'd be procedures that the branch would have to follow to recover that transaction.
And then D, when individual sub-postmasters experience or report problems, Pol's response can appear to be unhelpful, unsympathetic, or simply fail to solve the underlying problem. That's something we'll come on to look at because that's something that I think you looked at in depth.
Yeah.
E, the lack of effective outreach investigations function within Pol results in Pol failing to identify the root cause of problems and missing opportunities for process improvements. And then F, the end of trading period processes can be problematic for individual sub-postmasters, particularly if they're dealing with unresolved transaction corrections. The lack of a suspense account option means that it's difficult for disputed transaction corrections to be dealt with in a neutral manner. Now, when did you say you first saw this report?
When you sent me it.
In the pack for the inquiry.
Yeah.
Let's look at the branch support program. What was the purpose of the branch support program?
So that was set up on the back of I'd received the information second-hand around some of the thematic issues that might come through. So as a result of those conversations, the branch support program was set up, and that's what I was asked to lead.
Can we look at Pol 000399158? Thank you. Is this a document that you are familiar with?
Yes. Well, I
is
think I wrote it because my name's on the top.
Thank you. And if we look at the background, I'll just read that first paragraph. It says, to address the concerns about the Horizon system that have been raised by some sub-postmasters over recent years, the Post Office commissioned an independent review of their cases, so that's the Second Sight review. The company that conducted the review issued an interim report on the 8th of July 2013. The review made it clear that the Horizon computer system and its supporting processes function effectively across our network. Now, having not read the second site report yourself, where was that message coming from?
So that would have been conversations with myself and Angela van den Boogaard.
So is it something that Angela van den Boogaard had told you?
Yes, part of our discussions, part of the initiation of the programme.
Did you think it was unusual to be taking forward a programme that was based on a report that you hadn't read?
In hindsight, yeah, I should have asked to see the report. But I trusted the information that was being told to me.
Thank you. If we look at the scope, slightly down on the page, it says the interim report identified the following areas of concern which will be included within the scope of the programme. Post Office's attitude to sub-postmasters, which is often defensive and unsympathetic. So that's very close to what was written in the report itself. Inadequate help desk support with responses that are script-based, coupled with a decrease in overall branch support, lack of timely, accurate and complete information provided to sub-postmasters to support them in resolving issues, inexperienced trainers and gaps in training coverage, and lack of centralised data or files specific to each branch, which hinders the quality investigation from taking place. Now some of those do match what the second site report was saying. There is, of course, the absence there of the mention of the bugs and defects.
Yes.
Was that something that anybody mentioned in the context of your programme?
No.
One other thing I think that was missing from this scope was the reference to the F, which was the lack of a suspense account function in the second site report. Do you recall that final recommendation?
Yeah, I wasn't asked to look at that.
No. Were you aware of that being a concern?
I think at like a higher level, yeah.
Insofar as those were findings or based on findings from second site, do you agree that those were problems within the post office?
Yes.
Can we turn to page 2, please? Looking there at the governance and key stakeholders, it says Alice Perkins and Paula Vanells have requested the establishment of the programme, which will be led by Angela van den Boogaard. Gayle Peacock will be accountable for running the programme on an operational level. Had Miss van den Boogaard spoken to you about the second site report?
Yes, she will have done, yeah.
And was she the direct channel from which you were getting the
Yes.
summary of that report?
Yeah.
Did you speak to Alice Perkins or Paula Vanells at all?
Never Alice. I think I spoke to Paula once during the programme, but my interactions were with Angela.
And did any of them express any particular opinion on the second site investigation, the quality of that investigation, whether they disagreed or agreed with it?
I was given an indication that they probably weren't in the same place as second site and the conversations were difficult, but that was as far information that was shared with me.
And who was sharing that information?
That was with Angela.
If we look down on this table, these are the different key stakeholders. We have there, for example, at the bottom, Rod Ismay, Andy Wynne from Finance.
Yes.
Were they people who you discussed problems with Horizon?
Yeah, so I've had like working relationships with Rod and Andy from my days as network coordination.
And do they express any concerns about the operation of Horizon?
I don't think so.
If we go over the page to key deliverables, So the programme will be responsible for delivering the following: mapping the as-is process for providing branch support and the various touch points for branches, undertaking a gap analysis for each of the respective areas regarding the concerns raised in the interim report, producing recommendations for how the relevant gaps will be closed, supported by a deployment and resource plan. Was the plan, as far as this programme is concerned, to look at things as they then stood rather than look back at historic cases? Or did you intend to look at historic cases as well?
I think it was as they stood then.
So that the reference to as is, for example, is
Yeah, it's the current business operating model.
Are you aware at this time of any consideration being given to how problems that had been identified by Second Sight in their independent report had impacted potentially on historic prosecutions, terminations, suspensions, and things like that?
I knew that obviously there was discussions around if the prosecution policy was actually going to continue or not. I didn't know anything about the individual cases.
I mean, let's say those appeals that you had been part of, the termination appeals, did at this stage, knowing at least the information that had been provided to you about the Second Sight report, did that raise any concerns with you about whether people had been unfairly terminated previously?
Not at that stage, because the message was that Horizon was generally okay.
And the message from who?
I think it was just generally across the business. That was just the message that was given.
And where at that time did you consider that message was coming from?
I think it was top down, to be honest.
Top being?
Board level.
Can we look at page 4, please? Key performance indicators and measures. You have there, if we scroll down, a mention of branch losses and debt, and then mention of system, robustness of the system. Do you recall how these KPIs would be measured at all?
I can't recall those.
And then the final, page 5. The bottom of page 5, 7th of August 2013 is version 3 of this document. And it says input from programme board to include additional names, programme approach, definition of what good looks like, and confirmation that the programme will be run by Gayle Peacock. Who in particular do you recall inputting into these terms of reference? It says the programme board, but was there anyone who was particularly active or particularly involved?
No, I think it would have been shared with all the stakeholders listed as well, just to, if you're named in a document, you should see it. So I think they would have all seen it, plus Paula and Angela.
And did you ultimately produce a report arising from these terms of reference?
I can't recall specifically an end report. I know there was reports in terms of some of the measures on a regular basis, so some of the things that you mentioned in the table above in terms of how things were tracking. I remember producing those on a monthly basis. I don't know what the end, if there was an end report. I finished on maternity leave before the programme actually finished.
Are you aware of recommendations having been made?
Yeah, so there was a number of recommendations. So there was the branch user forum, which was implemented. There was the investigations team, which was I can't remember the term that was used, but this was like the investigative function to look at the losses. There was the recommendation to implement the case management system. Horace came out of the back of this as well, which we talked about earlier. There was some tactical changes that were made in terms of things like remittance slips were changed because one side didn't look like there was a pick list versus what the branch should rem in, which was confusing. So there was some tactical things. There was duplicate receipt changes. So there was a number of things that were done rather than just wait for the end report. But I can't remember the end report as such because I didn't produce it.
Do you know who produced it?
I don't know if there was one.
Can we look at poll 000-43369? And these, I'm going to start to go through these Bond Dickinson
Okay.
reports. Can you tell us the context of those reports?
So these were the notes that were taken from a weekly meeting. So there was a number of business stakeholders that took part in the calls. They were chaired by Bond Dickinson and Legal Services. And the purpose was to understand if there was any branches or issues or technical issues that the business actually needed to be aware of. So it was actually, were there any calls coming to MBSC that we were aware of? Was there anything that was being raised to myself or through other channels that the business needed to be aware of and make sure that the branch's issue was actually being resolved by the appropriate person?
Was it triggered by the second site report? Was it triggered by threatened litigation or something else?
I can't remember why they were initiated. I was just asked to participate, obviously with looking at improvements that could be made for that purpose.
Were you aware, for example, of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance around this stage, 2013?
Yeah, in terms of how it was, on the back of the second site work that was being done.
So this is the 2nd of October. You're mentioned there under network.
Yeah.
If we turn to page 3, please. They all follow a similar layout. So let's say we have Nelson there. What does that mean?
So that would have been a particular branch. That was Nelson Post Office.
And it says there, GP, I think that's yourself, has provided the discs to Helen Rose. Do you recall this at all?
I recall conversations about Nelson Post Office branch. I'm assuming that those were motor vehicle licence discs that had been returned, I think. The only thing that would be discs.
Do you know who Helen Rose was?
Yeah, so Helen Rose worked in the fraud and investigations team.
Do you remember her writing a report about Horizon?
I've seen it's referred to in the additional documents. I haven't seen that report.
And you didn't see it at the time?
No.
And then it says GP made the point that the Horizon issues had already been dealt with and those should not have been raised at the visit. Do you remember that? Are you able to assist us at all?
Yeah, I think so. This was a case that the business were already communicating with. So I think this is one of the case review team we're looking at in terms of the different things that could be causing the discrepancies. I can't recall what visit that alludes to. I'm assuming that somebody went out to the branch. Yeah, that's really the only thing I can remember for that.
Okay. We'll continue going through those documents, but before I do, I just want to bring to your attention poll 0002967. And this is, that is what we know as the Detica report of the 1st of October of 2013. So we're in October. This was a document that was in your pack. Have you ever seen this before?
I can remember reading it. Because I think as part of the input it mentions the non-conformance team, which would have been the branch standards team. So I can remember I think the Detica team did come and speak to, I think it was some of my team, in terms of the data sources that we used particularly for branch standards. So I think I did see this at the time.
Can we look at page 11? And we have there in the top paragraph, it summarises the second site report and what they thought of the second site interim report. It says, the initial findings of second site were published during the pilot. The review was prompted by a public campaign by sub-postmasters who felt they had been wrongly traduced by the post office following losses at their branches. Several of second site's observations resonate strongly notably the disjointed response by the Post Office and the habitual desire to assign responsibility to an individual rather than to conduct root cause analysis to close gaps persisting across the branch network. In order to have a consistent approach across the sub-postmaster estate, it is vital that Post Office has the ability to robustly identify and monitor anomalous behaviour so that the appropriate corrective action can be taken, whether this is tactical, education, enhanced training, process or system redesign, or audit/investigation. That's something you would have read at the time. Mm-hmm. Again, I mean, did that cause you any concern about, for example, having conducted those appeals in relation to terminations? Did you begin to have any concerns about the Horizon system?
Not on the Horizon system itself, no.
If we can look at page 37. And 7.2.2, complex and fragmented systems. Post office systems are not fit for purpose in a modern retail and financial environment. Our primary concern here relates to difficulty in reconciling information from multiple transaction systems, both in terms of timeliness, structure, and access. Are you aware of this report having caused anyone, for example, those who attended those meetings with Deloitte, with Bond Dickinson, any concerns about the Horizon system?
I don't think so. I don't think this report sort of highlighted any problems with Horizon.
So you didn't read that as being related to Horizon?
Not how Horizon was performing itself. I think there was the acknowledgement that the system integration and the multiple systems wasn't easy, but I don't think we read that as that undermined Horizon itself.
The references to the second site report that I took you to earlier, and about concerns about not conducting root cause analysis to close gaps persisting across the branch network and things like that, that didn't cause any concerns relating to the Horizon system?
No, I don't think so.
Can we look at poll 000433370? It's another one of those meetings, the 9th of October. In that first box, we have mention of Helen to see if she can link transactions to specific time, GP to report update in due course. Was that Helen Rose again?
Yes, it was, yeah.
And do you recall what this might be talking about at all?
I think Helen must have been looking to see if there was any investigation that she was doing. I'd have asked her to undertake an investigation for Pressbury, to see if there's any information that she could provide.
If we go over the page 2, and it's the bottom of page 2 that I'd like to look at. Andy Hayward from Securities, this is the person who's reporting the particular issue?
Yes, it would have been, yeah. So it's the person on the left is the person who's speaking, yeah.
So 2004, Carluke Post Office, police prosecution believed to have happened, blaming Horizon at the time. Elaine Dorham, SPM, passed away. Husband blaming Horizon and making noise through Scottish Parliament. Email details to be followed. No information due to time lapse. No records available. No further inquiries at this stage. Was there at this stage, so we're still October 2013, any questioning amongst those who attended these meetings or amongst the senior leadership of the safety of those kinds of prosecutions?
That wasn't discussed on this call, no.
And it's referring to a 2004 case. So was it looking back, or was it because somebody had called?
So the purpose of the call was obviously to any conversations that were being had. So Andy would have raised that as part of this weekly meeting to say this issue has now been raised, and actually as a business you need to be aware that the case from 2004 has now been raised and people are starting to talk about it again.
And was nobody querying at that meeting or at these series of meetings any concern about the reliability of convictions?
We didn't discuss it.
No. I mean, at this meeting and at many of the meetings, you have people from the legal team, so Roderick Williams, Jarnell Singh, Martin Smith of Cartwright King, Kaylee Harding. You'll have seen in your pack that there was advice given by a barrister, Simon Clark, on the 15th of July 2013,
yes.
So before these meetings took place. I don't need it to be brought on screen, but for the purpose of the transcript, it's Pol 00006357, and that raised serious questions about expert advice that had been given in prosecutions. Were you aware of that at this time?
I'd never seen that report until you sent it. I was aware that they were stopping the prosecutions, but I didn't know the reason why.
And Martin Smith of Cartwright King, for example, or Jarnell Singh, did any of them ever mention Gareth Jenkins, for example, at those meetings?
It was mentioned that he was the expert witness that was often used in prosecutions, but other than that, Gareth wasn't discussed.
So that there was no mention of any concern about the reliability of his evidence? What was the general attitude of those present when things like Carluke Post Office were brought up? Was there some scepticism?
I don't think so. I can't...
The reason I ask is the way it's phrased here, husband blaming Horizon and making noise through Scottish Parliament. Yeah. Making noise is a phrase that's cropped up a couple of times.
Yeah, because they don't believe it. I guess it's... I don't know why they would have used that phrase. The notes were written as somebody said it. But I could understand how that's interpreted, that, yeah, there's a cynical view that it's been made noise.
And how did that kind of a language sit with, for example, the branch support programme that had been going on, a more listening approach, perhaps, to branches' concerns?
I didn't pick up on that at the time and perhaps should have.
Can we look at poll 000433371? 16th of October now. So there are lots and lots of meetings. This is a very intense period of...
It was weekly, yeah. I can't remember for how long, but it was every Wednesday for a number of months.
Do you know who instigated them?
I think it was security, I think.
So they had asked for this series of meetings to take place? Or?
Yeah, and I presume it was on the back of obviously having seen the information about the disclosure document in the pack that this was deemed to be the right forum to make people aware of what was going on in the business.
When you say disclosure, do you mean the Simon Clark advice?
Yes.
So you hadn't seen the advice?
No.
Were you aware of it?
No.
Were you aware of some other purpose for the meetings? I mean, you've drawn the link between the Simon Clark advice and these meetings. Do you now reflect on it and think that there was a link?
Having seen the document, I now view it differently to how I did before. Before, my view was actually we just needed to get these branch issues resolved, A, know about them, and B, do something about it. Now, having seen the documents that led to it, it puts a slightly different view on it.
We have there attending this meeting security Dave Posnett. Is he somebody that you knew well?
Yeah, I knew him reasonably well. He worked, I think, in the fraud team in security.
If we turn to page 2, about halfway down in the left-hand column, you have the name Martin Griffiths.
Yes.
And it says there DP, so that's presumably Mr. Posnett.
Yes.
No further details on Horizon issue. SPM passed away. Were you aware that Mr. Griffiths was terminated in the summer of 2013. On the 23rd of September of 2013, he committed suicide. And on the 11th of October, so just shortly before this meeting, his life support machine had been turned off.
I think this was I was aware of that he'd attempted to commit suicide. I think this was the meeting where it was confirmed that he had passed.
So there was discussion at these meetings of Mr. Griffiths having
Passed away. Yeah.
It says passed away there, but the actual background was that discussed? So that the link, for example, to Horizon, was any link drawn between his suicide and Horizon?
We knew that. I think obviously there was claims being made at the time.
And what was the attitude at this meeting? Condolences, concern, or business as usual?
It's obviously condolences as well. You know, it's never nice when somebody passes away.
But was that the atmosphere at the meeting? And was there? It may strike people as a significant moment in time in the history of Horizon. Did it strike anybody on that occasion as significant or not?
I think it would have done. I can't particularly remember the instances of this particular call.
If we go down, please, to South Dartmouth. Questions as to whether NBSC properly capturing complaint. Not in relation to this particular incident, but just speaking more broadly, were there concerns that the NBSC weren't properly capturing complaints?
I think so. Then that was one of the things that we were looking at as part of the branch support programme, is how can you get advisors to, because I think it was quite apparent that people were just putting KB. So you'd look at a call log history into the Network Business Support Centre to try and find out what had happened, and there was instances where the advisor was putting KB, which referred to knowledge base, so they weren't actually recording, in some instances, what had been said to the postmaster, and this was the work that we were trying to do with them, because actually when you're trying to look at a case, KB isn't a useful piece of information to work out what happened or what was told to the postmaster to try and rectify any problem.
Do you know how long that had been going on for? Was that a historic problem, a long-lasting problem?
I think it was fairly historic, yes.
If we scroll down over the page, it says, RW, once Horizon disputed, it needs to be flagged. SPM to be questioned as to where discrepancy exists to prevent further issues in debt recovery process. What do you understand that to mean?
I think Roderick was just reinforcing the fact that as soon as anybody mentions any concerns, actually we need to know about it.
If we scroll down on this page, please, there is an entry with GP on the left-hand side at the bottom. And it says, Rodmill, issues log amalgamated, complaints sent before second site came into play, Director Paula. Are you able to tell us what you think that meant?
So I think that would have been a complaint that would have gone into Paula before the second site work had actually been commissioned.
So are you aware, and we will come on to this because I know that you were part of the executive correspondence team, but did sub-postmasters and others send complaints direct to Paula Vennels?
Yes.
And we have that. And where would they go from there, typically?
So it would depend on what the complaint was about. So it was usually, depending on the nature of the complaint that it was raised, it would be taken up with the senior manager responsible for that department. So if it was a post office kept closing, it would be the regional manager. If it was a stock or cash issue, it would be supply chain. If it was branch accounting, it would go to head of branch accounting, and they would be responsible for investigating the complaint and then providing a resolution.
It says, complaint cited many issues with Horizon, stock reconciliation numbers do not match and challenged, recording of first and second class label sales. Not clear whether this has been investigated. Is this something you remember, this particular incident?
I can't remember this, but I think it would have been triggered by the executive correspondence team. I didn't manage them at the time, but they would have approached us based on the work that we were doing and saying, you need to have a look at this one because we think that that's got further evidence.
If we scroll over the page, it says GP to look into which branches with complaints that have not been dealt with and report back.
Yeah, so that would have been going through the logs with the executive correspondence team, so they captured all of the complaints that were fed to Paula. So I'm assuming with that it would have been looking back on in any historic records and seeing if there were any similar ones that had been overlooked.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to poll 000400066. Thank you. If we could zoom in on the top there, thank you very much. It says Post Office Limited Initial Complaint Review and Mediation Scheme, Overview of Horizon and Branch Trading Practices. Can you tell us the background to this document?
I can't remember the document, but obviously I must have input it at some point because my name's on there. I think it was produced in preparation for the mediation process. So there were a number of branches that were going through that process to try and reach an agreement on how to resolve their case. I think this was various information that was put together to try and give the mediators some knowledge about post office branches and the types of issues that they may have.
Do you remember the period? I don't think it's dated. This is a draft.
I think this would have been about 2014, I think.
Thank you. If we look at page 23, we have there a section entitled Possible Reasons for Balance Discrepancies.
Yeah.
I'll wait for it to be brought up on screen. And as you said, it has your name here.
Yeah.
It seems as though you co-wrote this with Angela van der Bogert, or certainly...
Collated some information or something, yeah.
Do you know who would have written it, or who would have taken the lead? Would it have been you or Miss van der Bogert?
It was possibly me, I think. I can't recall writing it, but because my name's on there, I must have input it at some point.
You previously explained that Miss van der Bogert had detailed knowledge of the second site report, but at this stage you didn't.
Yeah, I hadn't seen it.
If we look down, these are reported as possible reasons for balance discrepancies. If we scroll down, the first is a miskey, so that's a staff entering the wrong value. Over the page, connectivity. Next, check handling. Next, staff actions. There wasn't, in any of this explanation of possible reasons for discrepancies, any mention of bugs, errors, or defects with Horizon. Having seen the interim second site report now, are you surprised that that wasn't mentioned?
Well, yeah, we would have included something if we'd have known that there was the possibility of error. It should have been included in there.
And during your discussions with Ms. van der Bogert in relation to this chapter or whatever we might call it in this document, did she ever mention to you the possibility of bugs, errors and defects as being a possible reason for a balance discrepancy?
No.
I'd like to just look at your statement, please. I don't have many questions left, just so we're clear for timing. Your statement is WITN 061601000, and it's paragraph 124. I'm going to give you the page number. page 41, 42 in fact, sorry. So 124, you're talking, I think, about the Horace
Yes.
system.
Yeah.
And then 125, you say, the process followed and improvements that I identified were based on the assumption that the Horizon system could not cause discrepancies in cash shortfalls. Had I known then about the issues with the system and the impact it could have had, then this would have completely changed my approach to the processes I was involved with. You're talking here, I think, about 2014 and the work that you carried out in
Yeah.
2014. So as at 2014, despite working closely with Angela van der Bogaard, you still, at that stage, weren't aware of the fact that the Horizon system could cause discrepancies in cash shortfalls. I mean, looking back at that now and considering that in what you now know, are you surprised that you didn't know? And can you come up with an explanation as to why you think you didn't know and weren't told?
I don't know, really. Whether it's because the post office didn't believe that it could be an issue, so discounted it. I don't know.
If we scroll down to paragraph 129, that's page 43. You say, even when the claims about Horizon started to be known within the business, the messaging coming from the business was that the system was not capable of impacting the amounts. I made the assumption the business had undertaken the relevant due diligence, etc. You refer to the business. Are you able to tell us who in the business you considered that messaging to be coming from?
Well, it was evident in, sort of the way that the group exec was talking. You've seen some of the comms from Tony Jamaz, those kinds of statements. That was what was just in the business. That was the language that was being used.
And where, in particular, do you think that message was coming from? Who, in particular, was that message coming from?
I would assume that would be board.
Anybody particularly? I mean, the board is made of a number of people.
But I don't think anybody can just do that one message. It's got to be, the board have got to agree to those messages. When you're communicating something so serious, I don't think it can just be one person that says, this is what it is. Everybody who is communicating that message at the board level needs to sign up to that.
Anybody in particular within the board that you felt was driving that message?
Well, I think, I don't know. I'd have no evidence to suggest who it would be,
I'm going to move on to the branch user forum. I think you've said it was established in 2014 and it arose as part of that work that you had been carrying out. Who formed part of that forum?
So it was a group of postmasters. So I think there was a communication that went out to branches that invited people to participate, and then they would literally just apply, and a decision was made. Angela chaired it. I think the first time it was set up, I think there was about 6 to 7 postmasters, and then in 2017, when Angela moved on to a different role, I took it over, and we invited people to apply again and took a range of postmasters.
Do you remember a sub-postmaster called Tim McCormack?
I do.
Do you recall any particular interaction with him?
Yes.
Can you tell us about it?
So Tim wanted to be part of the branch user forum. he was quite vocal. I had conversations with him. I understood, some of his concerns, some of his frustrations, and we had perfectly decent conversations. And I think, I can't remember what happened, but then I think I stopped communicating with him because the messages to myself became quite aggressive. So I'd get text messages on a Saturday, completely disagreeing with some of the information that I was telling him. And then that was the extent that I stopped my communication with him.
What do you recall of the concerns that he was raising?
I can't remember the specific time, but I think it was obviously he wanted to make some improvements to the way that the post office was operating, which was absolutely fine. I think he'd had an IT background, I think, from what I can recollect, and I think he wanted to make some suggestions and improvements. I think that's what his general sort of response was about.
If it's suggested that he was excluded from the user forum by Angela van der Bogert, would you agree or disagree with that?
I think I'd probably partially agree. I think there was some concerns. Constructive criticism is absolutely fine. I think there was some. I don't know if that was it was going to be a challenging discussion. You want to make some outputs. I think I probably agree with that statement.
Looking back now at how serious everything in fact was, do you think it was a mistake to exclude him from that forum?
I don't think anybody should be excluded if they've got suggestions to make. I think there was probably some disagreements over behaviours.
Paragraph 92 of your witness statement, you also refer to feedback sessions. Are they separate to the branch user forum? Or are they something different? Or
Yeah, so this was separate. So on the back of, in order to validate, there was some of the findings. Myself and Anne, who worked with me at the time, in order to sort of gauge what some of the issues were, there was a number of people around the business that we spoke to and postmasters. So this was on the back of the thematic issues that had come out in terms of training and support. So it was very much about, what could we do differently, what ideas have you got, etc., etc.
You refer to a range of stakeholders. Are you able to give us a little bit more detail?
Yes, it would have been postmasters, basically anybody who had direct intervention with postmasters. So spoke to network business support centre advisors, contracts advisors, field support trainers and auditors, people in product and branch accounting, security advisors, the National Federation of Postmasters, people who had that interaction themselves.
You mentioned the NFSP. Were there any other unions, such as the Communications and Workers Union? Or?
No, it was just the National Federation of Postmasters.
And is there a reason why it was them in particular?
I think there was discussions internally around, the National Federation of Postmasters was the recognised union of the postmasters. I don't think Post Office recognised the CWU formally as the union of postmasters. Therefore, we weren't encouraged to talk to them.
And the final topic that I have is the executive correspondence team. That seems to be from 2015, I think, when you were head of branch and customer support. Can you give us a flavour of the kinds of correspondence that sub-postmasters and their assistants or managers made in relation to bugs, errors and defects in Horizon? How early were they corresponding on those issues in your time? How often?
I can't remember any specifically. I don't know if there was a process that was set up with legal services because of the potential litigation that we almost didn't deal with those, if that makes sense. I think it was one of those where, if that was where it was flagged, I think they were put to the legal department. I can't be 100% sure, but I think that based on obviously what was going on at the time, I think it had been agreed that that's the process that would follow. So we didn't attempt to respond to those ones. That would go to legal services.
Typically, in relation to correspondence, how would you interact with the CEO or other executives? I mean, did you have a direct line to them? Would you raise significant issues with them?
Yeah, you could ask to speak to, anybody at whatever time they needed to be aware, especially if they'd been written to, because it was usually that person that would say, can you respond to that one? Because sometimes they would go to their personal email address, which they'd pick up, and then it'd end up being back with the correspondence team, or it would be via an MP or whatever. But yeah, you could approach any of the board members, and if there was a particular one that, in the main, they were happy that you were dealing with those issues. But if there was a particularly sensitive one, then the door was always open to have that discussion, and especially if you were writing back in somebody's name, they had to sign that off.
And I think you said that typically the letters about bugs, errors and defects, they would go to the legal team.
I think they did, yeah.
Was that an instruction from somebody?
I think that probably would have come from legal services. So Jane McLeod and her team, I think it probably would have been at the time.
So do you recall an instruction from them that if people are communicating about bugs, errors and defects, they should send them to them rather than to deal with them within your team?
I can't be 100% sure, but the fact that I can't remember dealing with any would suggest that that's what happened. That's my recollection, but I can't be 100% sure.
Thank you. Finally, could we just have a look at paragraph 146 of your statement? So it's WITN 06160100. Page 49. It says, my experience of working in the post office was that it operated within a strict risk control framework, and there were processes in place for making decisions. Any change to policy, approach, request for funding, etc. had to be signed off at the highest levels, sometimes including the shareholder, and it did not appear that individuals could make decisions in isolation or outside of their remit. Before the separation of Post Office from Royal Mail Group, there were internal processes for approvals, and then this would go to the Royal Mail boards for further approval. Once decisions had been made and strategies agreed, this then filtered down into individual objectives at every level in the organisation. It wasn't an environment where you could just do what you wanted if you felt like it. Was it an environment where it was difficult to speak out?
I think it depended on the individual. I personally didn't feel as though, if I had an issue, I felt I could raise it. I think some people felt that they couldn't for whatever reason. There was the whistleblowing line. There were sensitive cases that people did speak out, that obviously they went to the executive correspondence team that I was privy to, because obviously it was my team that were responding to, so people were raising issues. People were encouraged to say what they think. Whether it was agreed with is a different matter. But I, on a personal level, didn't feel I could not raise something.
I mean, we've looked at, for example, the second site report that wasn't shared with you. Mm-hmm. Was there, in respects of bugs, errors and defects, information that was kept from you, do you think, intentionally?
I don't know, and I've reflected on this, obviously, since you've sent the information. And, when you ask the question, like in the witness statement, well, why were you selected to do the branch support programme? The positive side of me goes, because I thought I had the right skills to do the job. Having seen some of this stuff, the cynical part of me goes, well, was I picked because I I would do what I was told. I don't know. I trusted the people that I worked for. I accepted the information that was in good faith. So I don't know what they kept from me. I wouldn't like to think that they were deliberately doing that, but I couldn't, unless you ask them, I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Peacock. I don't have any further questions. I think there is a small number of questions.
Yeah, I'm anxious that the transcriber shouldn't be asked to continue unless it really is just 5 or 10 minutes maximum. All right, so
I think I'll be 5 minutes.
right. Nobody else?
Ms. Page.
I do have a few. I mean, if I were 10 minutes, then I don't think I will be. But
I think we'll just take a few minutes break so that the transcriber can just have a short rest since she's not very well. And we'll come back again at 1:15, and then we'll be as swift as we can be. How about that?
Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Peacock, good afternoon. I represent 156 sub-postmasters who instruct Howe & Co. who instruct me. You told Mr. Blake earlier on this afternoon that a lot of your career was spent providing support to sub-postmasters. Is that right?
Yes.
And you also said, when you were asked about unprofessional conduct of auditors, you couldn't remember any examples.
Not that had been raised to me.
Okay. I want to ask you about one of our clients, Shazia Sadiq. And I don't know if you followed the phase 1 of the hearings when sub-postmasters gave evidence last year.
No.
Well, her evidence was read into the record on the 16th of March 2022. And just as a whistle-stop summary, she was a sub-postmaster with 3 branches in Newcastle.
Okay.
She paid over £10,000 in relation to alleged shortfalls. Post Office demanded another £20,000 of her in relation to further alleged shortfalls, and she was a victim of cyber fraud. And as a result of the Horizon system being vulnerable, she says, to hackers, and the Post Office held her liable for the recovery of that theft by third parties in the sum of £33,000.
Is this the MoneyGram one?
The MoneyGram one.
Right.
You remember. Good.
Yes, I do, yes.
So, shall we go then to Miss Sadiq's statement?
Yeah.
And that is at WITNO 2230100, page 7 of 16, please. Thank you. That's on the screen. So if we could look at paragraph 32, you'll see, as you correctly say, the MoneyGram transfers.
Yes. Yeah.
She was initially told that only her branch was affected, but it was later accepted that it affected 11 other branches, she says. My client's evidence is at paragraph 34 that Post Office wrote to her, told her that it would be holding her responsible for the losses calculated at nearly £34,000. So if we could then go to paragraph 35, which is the one I particularly wanted to ask you about.
Yes.
So she says that on 20th of August 2014, she met with Rachel Lax and you, and you described yourselves as Post Office internal investigators. You reviewed her personal finances in detail to determine what payments she could afford to make towards this sum of money that was stolen, she says, via the Horizon system. So do you recall that meeting?
I do, actually. I can't recall that. I think I would have said I'm investigating the issue. I don't think I would have said I'm an investigator, but I do remember the meeting. Yeah, because yeah.
Well, then we'll move on to what Ms. Sadiq has to say about the meeting, which is over the page at paragraph 36, please. So she says, this was a deeply humiliating experience as they were looking through all my personal bank and other records. And this was done in a public area of Holiday Inn Hotel. As they looked at my records, they made comments about where I bought my children's shoes from. This was none of their business. I was also very embarrassed as I lived very humbly. I spent as little as I could on myself and maintaining my family, so it was humiliating to have strangers pore over my personal accounts in public and see how little I spent on myself and my children. Now, I want to ask you some questions about that. Why was the meeting held in a public area in a hotel?
Because that's where she requested it to be held.
We understand that this is where you suggested it was to be held.
I didn't know the area at the time, and I asked to meet at her branch, and this was where she suggested that we meet.
Did you think it was appropriate to ask her to go through personal details in a public area?
In hindsight, probably not. At the time, she didn't mention it, but then I guess she probably, if she felt that she couldn't raise it to me. I'm really disappointed that I've had that effect on her. I didn't know that.
Well, if we could go to paragraph 37, please. You'll see she goes on to say, at the end of this humiliating meeting where it was made clear I had no money to pay the post office to make up for the crime, the MoneyGram cyber attack that has been perpetrated against my post office, the investigators said they would put a charge on my properties. They said this as if they were doing me a favour. Do you recall that?
So there was some discussion internally about the whole MoneyGram issue anyway, in terms of the number of branches that were affected. There was sort of a decision around who would be held liable, what the approach would be. We did talk about how her business was performing and her income levels. I'm not going to deny that. I knew that was an approach that the post office could take. I don't think we ended up going down that route. That's not my interpretation of the meeting, but if that's what she said, then that's what she said.
You've said that just now that, and the transcript keeps jumping around. You said that you regret that it had this effect on her. Do you regret the way that you and your colleague conducted this meeting, in light of her evidence now?
If that's how it made her feel, then yes.
Can we go to paragraph 39? She subsequently had a breakdown as a result of the pressure that the post office were putting her on.
Okay.
The question that Ms. Sadiq wants me to ask is, do you accept that this was insensitive and unprofessional as a way to behave towards a business person?
Yes, if that's the... yeah.
Now, you said earlier on in your evidence that you weren't aware of any complaints that had been made in relation to audits. I just want to ask you, a number of our clients gave evidence in the Phase 1 hearings, and they said that the Post Office adopted a tactic, seemingly, of humiliating them in public. Shanaz Rashid and Heather Early talk about surprise audits where auditors marched in to their branches that were full of customers and closed the branches down. And Catherine McIlerney talks about aggressive questioning of her in front of her customers. Are you aware of auditors and investigators adopting these tactics when they were investigating sub-postmasters?
I think when we did the review on the second site, I think there was the feedback that some of the security team were maybe being a bit too masculine in the approach and aggressive in terms of, as you delved into some of the feedback and you asked people about, their experience, that did come to, there was a feeling, but I didn't have any specific, I couldn't give you a branch, for example, to say this one was raised with me.
Okay. You, I think, were taken by Mr. Blake to paragraph 129 of your statement. I don't think we need to turn it up. Well, I know you've got it. I can see you have it in front of you there. So perhaps we will turn it up. You say, even when the claims about Horizon started to be known within the business, the message coming from the business was that the system was not capable of impacting the accounts. And the question that my clients have asked me to ask you is looking back at, now, and I know, just interjecting, that you've talked about comments where people were saying that sub-postmasters were making noise, and you said that there was a cynical attitude. Looking back, do you accept that the Post Office's refusal from the top to countenance the possibility of errors led to a high-handed and unprofessional treatment of sub-postmasters by auditors and investigators?
I didn't experience that personally, but I could see how that was correct in some cases.
That the view from the top led to the mindset of the investigators in this way?
Yeah, I think it was, a dismissive approach will filter down.
I just need to ask to see if I have any more questions to ask you. Thank you. I haven't got any further questions.
This page.
Thank you. I also represent some sub-postmasters. You've told us that you were aware of the discontinuance of prosecutions, end of 2013 going into 2014. How did you come to know about that?
That was just discussed as part of the, the branch support programme, the conversations with Angela. We were obviously working with security and legal services quite heavily as part of that, as the programme. So I was made aware that, it was pausing given everything else that was going on.
When you say everything else that was going on, what do you mean by that?
So, obviously the second site review, the claims that were being made, that kind of stuff. The view that I got was, that it wasn't appropriate to continue prosecuting, and that was the message which you accepted.
When you said it just now, you said pausing. Is that something that you understood at the time? Is that the way it was being expressed, or was it going to be stopped completely?
I don't think anybody had made any decision. I knew we weren't going to, but I don't know. I didn't get the impression. I didn't know whether that was permanent at the time, or whether it was pausing, or it was just stopping.
And when you had those conversations, do you remember if that came from Angela or from security? Or
I think it came from both.
Okay. Now that you've seen the documents from Mr. Simon Clark, you've drawn a line between that and the discontinuance of prosecutions. Can you just help us with your reasoning there and your conclusion? Why have you drawn that line?
What do you mean by draw the line?
Well, you said now that I've seen the documents from Mr. Clark, I can see why they stopped the prosecutions. What makes you say that?
Well, because I think that they hadn't disclosed the fact that actually bugs could do it. So I can now see the reason why the prosecutions had stopped, because there was the potential that the prosecutions were unsound.
And then during those conversations with Miss van den Boogaard and security people, by which you mean presumably Mr. Posnet, do you?
No, Mr. Scott. It would be John Scott was head of security at the time.
John Scott. Did either of them ever mention to you the idea that there might be a litigation risk that needed to be notified to Pol's insurers?
No, I can't remember that.
Just sticking with Mr. Clark's advices for a moment, in your pack from the inquiry, you've had two, haven't you?
Yes.
You've had the one which relates to Mr. Jenkins and the one which relates to the minuting of the weekly Horizon meetings. That second one about the minuting of the Horizon meetings, albeit you didn't see it at the time, were you aware at the time that there was an issue around the minuting and the keeping of the minutes?
I think because I think Bond Dickinson undertook the note keeper role, so I think there was a paralegal involved in the weekly meetings. And I think because it varied week on week, I think it was mentioned at the start why the paralegals were basically to make sure that it was fully documented, and I think that was the extent of which it was introduced.
So you weren't aware at any time that there was an issue around the keeping of those minutes or the keeping of them securely?
No.
The representatives from security, Second Sight had found at this stage that there was a a focus in security on asset recovery solutions without first establishing the underlying root cause of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that you would have recognised at the time if you had have been told about it?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
If you'd have read that second site report, which
Yeah.
had that finding in it,
Yes.
is that something that would have chimed for you at the time, knowing the people that you knew from security, Dave Posnett, Rob King?
Yes.
Yeah. Then on Mr. Griffiths, after that meeting that we've looked at the note of,
Mm-hmm.
did you hear any more about him from Miss van den Bogart?
So I think they attended the funeral of Mr. Griffiths. I think there was, I can't remember if Angela attended. I think Anne Alliker did attend, I think, on behalf of Post Office. And they were talking to the family. I don't know the ins and outs of the conversations. And that was the extent of the knowledge on that particular case.
So you didn't hear anything about a settlement made to the family?
No. I'm presumed it might have gone through one of the mediation cases potentially, but I can't confirm that.
On the Detica report, would you accept that it was covering some of the same ground that you were given to look at in the branch support programme?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And was it given to you with that in mind, as it were?
I think it was. I think it was to sort of. I think the Detica report. It was. They were trying to do a business case to actually progress Detica into the business, and I think I saw it to see if there was themes that we were picking up. But yeah, I think it was just to substantiate some of the issues. Some of the stuff in the Detica report wasn't surprising.
Would you accept it was quite a critical report?
Yes.
And in light of that, is it perhaps a bit surprising that it wasn't mentioned in any of the branch support programme documentation? It wasn't discussed more widely?
In what way, the issues? Because the Detica report didn't seem to have a lot of recommendations.
The issues that they found, the problems that they found?
I think we probably did discuss them, whether it's been documented or minuted. I'm not sure, but we were definitely aware of them.
Just finally, with the benefit of hindsight, and I appreciate what you've been quite sort of careful about thinking about things in terms of at the time and hindsight. This is specifically a hindsight question. Do you think that, given that the second site review was sort of rather filleted for you, if I can put it that way, that the bits that were filleted out and given to you for the branch support programme to look at, do you think that was really a sort of a sop from Pole management to seem as if they were taking the concerns seriously, to seem as if they were acting on second site's recommendations whilst actually blocking or impeding those investigations?
So I can see how you make that interpretation. I think my perspective of it, I felt there was a genuine, genuine need and requirement to change some of the things that were given to us. I genuinely believed that that wasn't paying lip service. I think in some ways, the second site report in that aspect gave momentum to some of the feelings that were known. I don't think the issues that we were looking at were actually paying lip service. I think people genuinely wanted to change those areas. I don't think it was as a distraction. I don't know why they didn't consider the Horizon stuff as seriously they did, but I genuinely believed that they wanted to change things for the better
At the time,
at the time.
looking back,
The cynical part of me says yes, maybe a little bit, but I think it was too much hard work for it to completely be like dismissed and a sop. I think that the genuine, to improve things for postmasters was there. Whether you want to accept that, that's entirely up to you. I personally believe that the genuine belief was there to do it, given some of the, not everybody, those stakeholders mentioned on that agenda, I think genuinely did believe that we should change things. I think some of them did pay lip service to the programme, and part of what we were trying to do, we came across challenging conversations with people to try and get them to believe that. And I think we wouldn't have gone through some of those arguments and disagreements had we not genuinely believed that we absolutely had to change the training and support for postmasters.
well, thank you. Those are my questions.
Well, thank you for providing a detailed witness statement, and thank you for coming to give oral evidence.
You're welcome.
Right, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mr. Blake.
Thank you very much, sir.